Most people do not make it through their spiritual awakening, not because their bodies fail, but because something far more delicate fractures. The identity they spent years, even decades, defending. Awakening does not arrive as a gentle invitation. It does not greet you with soft light or peaceful knowing. It arrives as a storm, pulling apart the scaffolding of the self you built for survival. Suddenly, the roles you played, the beliefs you held, and the stories you told to feel safe begin to collapse. You find yourself standing in the rubble of everything you thought was true, and your mind panics. The heart resists. The ego clings. And for many, the pain of this unraveling feels unbearable. This is the moment where most turn back. They numb. They distract. They return to the illusion not because it's fulfilling, but because it's familiar. The world praises awakening as a moment of bliss, of arrival, but what it rarely shows is the part where everything disorients before it aligns. The silence that screams louder than any noise. The emotional disorientation that feels like losing the ground beneath your feet. The slow disintegration of the masks you wore for so long you forgot your face beneath them. And yet, this is not the end. It is the sacred beginning. For those who stay with the pain and do not abandon themselves when the mirror shows something hard to face, a deeper truth emerges. A quieter self begins to rise. Not the perfect self, not the one shaped by approval or expectation, but the real one. The one untouched by performance. The one who was buried beneath roles, rules, and repetition. Jung called this descent into the unconscious, a necessary stage of individuation, the breaking apart that must happen before wholeness is remembered. This is the truth most never speak of. Awakening is not about becoming someone new. It is about meeting what you've always been, beneath the noise. And the cost of meeting that truth is often everything that once gave you a false sense of safety. But for those who choose to keep going, something astonishing happens. The self that emerges is not just awake, it is rooted, real, unshakable. You were taught that awakening would feel like light, like clarity descending from the heavens, but that is only part of the truth. The other part lives in the shadows, in the quiet undoing of everything you once called real. Awakening does not come gently. It begins when the veil thins and you start to see through the stories that held your life together. You look around and the world remains intact, but something within you begins to crumble. Not your body, not your mind, but the invisible architecture of meaning that once gave your life its shape. The roles you played, the beliefs you swore by, even the sacred icons you clung to, begin to feel strangely empty, as if their purpose has expired without notice. This unraveling is not a mistake. It is the very moment Jung pointed to when he said there is no coming to consciousness without pain. Because to awaken is not to be comforted, it is to be confronted. With illusions, with half-truths, with the realization that what once felt like purpose may have only been protection, a necessary construction to shield you from the depth of truth your soul was not yet prepared to hold. These weren't lies in the malicious sense. They were scaffolds, temporary means built to help you survive, to belong, to make sense of a world too vast to comprehend when you were still unready. But something shifts. The old frameworks no longer contain you. You begin to feel like a stranger in your own life, going through motions that once made sense but now feel hollow. This is the rupture, the existential ache, the invitation to go deeper. You are no longer satisfied with surface meanings or second-hand beliefs. The structures collapse, not to punish you, but to free you. This collapse is not the end of meaning, it is the beginning of truth. When your world starts to dissolve from the inside out, you are not falling apart, you are falling into awareness. And though the descent feels like a crisis, It is the soul's quiet revolt against a life that no longer reflects its depth. This is the moment you stop performing and start awakening, not in the light, but in the sacred dark. And from that dark, something real begins to stir. Something ancient begins to stir within you, not new, but long forgotten. It is not loud, it does not arrive with fanfare. It whispers through the emptiness you now feel, in the places that once made you feel alive. You notice it first in the stillness, in the quiet ache that no longer goes away. The dreams you once chased feel strangely distant, as though they belonged to another version of you. The people who once reflected your identity no longer feel like home. The things that used to spark desire now pass through you without meaning. What once brought comfort now feels like a distraction from something deeper that refuses to remain buried. This is not confusion. This is the slow unfolding of an inner death. The ego, the identity you built to survive, begins to dissolve. This is not poetic language. It is a psychological reality. Your sense of self begins to unravel. You no longer recognize your own reflection. The voice that once narrated your life begins to feel like an echo of someone you no longer are. This is what Jung alluded to when he spoke of the confrontation with the unconscious. What awakens is sacred, but it requires the collapse of the false self that stood in its way. And yet, the ego does not surrender quietly. It resists. It cries out. It pleads for the familiar. It tells you that you are lost, broken, and mistaken. It urges you to retreat into the numbness of old patterns. It labels this process with words like confusion, sadness, and failure. But these are the defenses of a structure that knows it is crumbling. The pain you feel is not proof of something wrong. It is the pressure of truth trying to break through the shell of illusion. If you resist this inner death, the suffering sharpens. If you fight it, you may feel as though you are unraveling into madness. But if you surrender, not passively but with presence, you will feel the tearing open into something eternal. You will touch the part of you that was never lost, only hidden. And in that moment, you will realize that what is dying is not your life, but the image of you that was never whole to begin with. This is why most people cannot complete their awakening. The death of the ego feels too much like the end. But for those who stay, what awakens is not perfection, but presence. Not certainty, but truth. Not more of what you were, but something entirely new. Not an addition, but a return. You were taught how to succeed in the world, how to blend into its rhythm, how to wear the faces it deemed acceptable. But you were never taught how to be whole. You were never taught how to fall inward, how to unravel the polished surface and meet the rawness that lives beneath the persona. So when the descent comes, it feels like ruin. But this descent is not your end. It is an initiation, a spiral, not downward into despair, but inward into the sacred cavern of your becoming. Awakening is not an ascent to something higher, but a return to something deeper. It asks not for performance, but for presence. Not for more masks, but for the courage to shed them one by one. You will be asked to let go of what was never real. Titles, roles, personas, attachments. They fall away like dead skin. You will lose things. You will lose people. You will lose all the identities you thought would define you forever. And this loss will not come gently. If you try to carry the old self into the new consciousness, it will decay in your hands. Because awakening does not upgrade your life. It dismantles it. It burns the scaffolding of illusion and waits patiently among the ashes to see if you are brave enough to rebuild, not from memory, but from truth. Most do not stay. They retreat to the comfort of what they know. The known pain feels safer than the unknown freedom. They choose validation over authenticity, applause over inner peace. Because facing the wilderness within is terrifying. It speaks a language that cannot be translated by logic. It asks you to feel without numbing. It asks you to see without flinching. And in that mirror, what appears is not your light, but your shadow. It is the part of you that was cast out long ago, the one that wept for love and received silence, the one that learned to control, to manipulate, to withdraw just to survive. That part returns now, not to harm, but to be held. True awakening requires you to welcome it, not with fear, but with compassion, not to fix, but to listen. But make no mistake, the shadow does not arrive sweetly. It arrives through your triggers, your defensiveness, and your sabotage. It arrives in jealousy, in comparison, in fear of abandonment. It arrives when you almost touch what you want, then push it away. Until you face it, you will remain trapped in a loop. But the moment you turn toward it with openness, the moment you invite it to the table, something ancient begins to heal. The part of you that was never loved finally receives the presence it always needed. And in that sacred meeting, you begin to remember who you were before the world taught you to forget. This is the part that few truly understand. Spiritual awakening does not deliver you into peace, it initiates you into presence. It is not the end of suffering, but the moment you are asked to sit face to face with it, to no longer run, deny, or disguise it. Awakening is not a gentle light that soothes you. It is a fire that strips you bare. It asks for your grief without filters, your rage without shame, your silence without escape. It asks you to enter the unknown with no guarantee of who you will become. It is the death of the familiar self, while your lungs still fill with breath. It is the collapse of everything false. And even in the ruins, you are asked to say yes, not because you are strong, but because you are ready to surrender. And this is the sacred threshold the ego fears most. For the ego survives by illusion, by controlling the narrative, maintaining appearances, and suppressing discomfort. It was designed to protect you, not to awaken you. But the soul? The soul is not here to protect what is temporary. It is here to reveal what is eternal, and that revelation begins only through the unraveling. You must take off the armor you thought kept you safe. You must dismantle the stories that kept you small. You must allow the identity you clung to fall into dust. Then, in the stillness that follows, something ancient begins to stir. It does not come with certainty. It does not make demands. It waits. It waits until your mind quiets, until the performance ceases, until the masks are too heavy to wear. Then it speaks, not in language, but in longing. A silent ache for something real, not more success or attention, but more wholeness, more truth, more aliveness. This ache is not an error. It is not failure. It is the sacred signal. It is the soul's whisper that you are ready to leave behind the lie, but most ignore it. They bury it beneath to-do lists. They silence it with accomplishment. They drown it in distractions dressed as comfort, because answering it means letting go of the world you built to survive, and no one tells you how lonely that shedding will feel. The first chapter of awakening is not joy, it is exile, a stepping away from the familiar roles, the acceptable persona, the cultural script you did not know you were reading from. In that exile, your old self will call you back. It will tempt you with ease, with certainty, with numbness. But something deep in you will refuse, because once you have glimpsed your own soul, you cannot return to surface living, and so you find yourself in the in-between. Not who you were, not yet who you are becoming. This liminal space is terrifying, but it is holy. It is the cocoon, the void, the sacred pause. is where your soul does its deepest work, and in that stillness, your shadow appears, no longer hidden, no longer willing to be suppressed. It rises through your triggers, your emotional patterns, your quiet ache, not to torment you, but to ask if you are finally ready to meet yourself completely. And of course, you want to run. Every part of you that was trained to seek relief and avoid discomfort begins to tremble. You were taught from a young age to flee pain, to fix it quickly, to decorate it with positivity, or conceal it behind spiritual slogans. You were taught that suffering must be silenced, not studied. But awakening is not a retreat from pain, it is a reckoning. It is the slow turning of your gaze toward the wound, not with judgment, but with presence. It asks you not to bypass what aches, but to descend into it, not to patch it, but to listen to it, to sit in its presence as if it were a sacred teacher, holding a truth that comfort could never offer. And then, something remarkable happens. You begin to understand that pain was never your adversary. It was your unspoken guide. It was the crack in the armor, the tender fault line through which your buried essence could finally breathe. You begin to feel the grief, the rage, the sorrow not as flaws, but as forgotten messengers. Each one holds a sliver of your wholeness. Each one returns a memory of what was lost. And the longer you stay, the more they soften. You find yourself no longer flinching, but listening. And in that listening, compassion arises. Not the kind you were taught to extend to others, but the kind you withheld from yourself. You feel it for the child in you who never felt safe to cry. You feel it for the adolescent who masked their truth behind sarcasm and silence. You feel it for the adult who measured their worth through endless doing, who confused being useful with being lovable. And through those tears, something sacred begins to shift. The illusion of perfection fades. The hunger for performance dissolves. You no longer seek healing as a way to be fixed. You begin to seek truth, raw and unapologetic. This is the essence of awakening. Not becoming flawless, but becoming honest. Honest about the scars, the beauty, the chaos, the contradiction. You are human and divine, fragile and infinite, and the soul does not ask you to choose between them. It asks you to embrace both. And when you do, truth becomes your foundation. Not the kind of truth that needs defending, but the kind that sets you free. You no longer beg for validation from places that cannot hold your light. You no longer betray your essence for the comfort of fitting in. You begin to realize that the safety you longed for was not out there. It was always your own presence, your own devotion to stay with yourself when the pain returns. And when you stop running, truly stop, everything changes, not because the pain disappears, but because you are finally home within it. This is the threshold most never cross, not because they lack strength, but because they were never taught the sacred art of remaining. Remaining in the discomfort long enough for it to transmute. Remaining in the unknown without reaching for false certainty. Remaining with the soul until it finally finds the words it was never given. Yet here you are, remaining. And because you do not flee, something begins to take root within you. Not perfection, not performance, but something real, something ancient. You begin to feel yourself aligning not with borrowed identities, but with a pulse that has always been yours. You become less interested in looking alive and more devoted to being alive, rooted, aware, and quietly unshakable. And this is where the real transformation begins. You begin to notice how much of your life was not truly your own. How many of your dreams were inherited, not chosen. How many of your desires were shaped by fear and molded by generations who knew survival, but not wholeness. You begin to see the masks you wore, not to deceive, but to be loved. You see how often you traded your truth for safety, your essence for acceptance. And in this seeing, a holy fire rises. Not the fire of destruction, but the fire of remembrance. A sacred anger. There is thunder in the chest that says, I was not born for a life of sleep. It is not regression, it is resurrection. It is the fierce return of a self you abandoned only because no one showed you how to keep it alive. And from that place your voice begins to shift. You speak less to please and more to stand. You say no with clarity, yes with peace. You no longer dilute your truth for comfort or explanation. You no longer apologize for being whole, and the world, which once found you familiar, now finds you mysterious. You are no longer a pattern that it can predict. You are no longer a reflection of its fear. You become a living mirror, exposing unconsciousness simply by walking in your light. This is embodiment, not the projection of healing, but the quiet, daily choice to become it, not the performance of awakening, but the devotion to living it, especially when it costs you, and it will. Some days it will look like tears behind the wheel as your nervous system unwinds lifetimes of suppression. Some days it will sound like silence in a room once filled with voices, now echoing with absence. Some days it will feel like grief for a life built with love, yet no longer aligned with who you've become. But underneath it all, there is something unshakable. The truth that you no longer need to prove. You are no longer chasing, you are simply being, and that is more powerful than anything you were ever taught to perform. This is the hidden price of becoming. You do not merely shed illusions, you shed the very skins of who you thought you were, the names you clung to, the comforts that once gave you shape. The scaffolding you built to hold yourself together begins to collapse, and you realize it no longer supports your truth. It cages it. And in the quiet that follows, there is no immediate clarity. There is no new identity ready to rush in. There is only vastness, a sacred emptiness where the old cannot survive, and the new has yet to root. You awaken each day not knowing who you are, as though reborn and ancient at once. You try to speak, and words feel brittle. You try to plan, and the future stays silent, as if whispering that this is not the time for building. It is time to listen. And so you listen, beneath the noise, beneath the fears, beneath the stories you once called your life. You hear the soft murmur that says, let go. Let go of the timeline. Let go of the design. Let go of the need to name where this is going. Let it dismantle you. Let it shape you in ways no blueprint could. Let it reveal what is left when nothing remains to defend. And what remains is not who you tried to become, it is who you were before you began to pretend. The breath, the stillness, the heartbeat of presence. You meet yourself, not the persona, not the performance, but the original self that existed before the world taught you to shrink. That self does not chase purpose, it radiates it. Not in achievement, but in motion. In how you walk, in how you speak. How do you stay tender when life tries to make you callous? Meaning is no longer something to grasp, it becomes something you embody. In each moment, you choose not to abandon yourself, even when the world misunderstands you. This is the deeper current of awakening. The path no one teaches, because it cannot be taught. It is not a theory, it is a rhythm, a return, a sacred remembering of who you were before the story began. And when you no longer visit this place, but live from it, the world does not explode into brilliance. It quiets, but that quiet is filled with truth. You no longer explain yourself to those who have never heard you. You no longer give away your knowing to those who sell certainty. You stop betraying your own soul for comfort, And in that stillness, something profound awakens. You stop chasing love. Because you finally understand, you are it. You are what you have been seeking all along, not in the reflections others offer you, not in a distant future where you finally become enough, but here, in this present moment, in the quiet core of your being. The awakening was never about achieving some enlightened version of yourself. It was about remembering the truth you buried beneath survival, performance, and fear. You no longer need to chase it because you are beginning to embody it. The search ends, not with a dramatic revelation, but with a soft return to what has always been within you. You stop running, not because the path is suddenly clear, but because you've learned to stand in the unknown and call it home. You no longer plead for validation or clarity. You no longer exhaust yourself trying to be understood. You trust now that what is meant for you will remain, not because you hold it tightly, but because your truth magnetizes what is aligned. You stop forcing, stop striving, stop shaping yourself to fit places that were never built to hold your depth. You no longer confuse stillness with stagnation. You begin to feel the strength that comes not from controlling life, but from being rooted in your essence, regardless of what life brings. It is a quiet, sacred power. It does not perform, it simply is. There is a grace that follows those who stayed through the inner collapse. Not the loud kind, the kind that walks gently but transforms everything it touches. You carry that now, not to preach, but to reflect. Not to lead, but to mirror. You become the silent invitation for others to meet themselves. And though some may flee your presence, unable to bear their own reflection, others will awaken. Not because you demanded it, but because your stillness reminded them of their own. You no longer ask, "Who am I meant to be?" You live the answer. You rest without guilt. You speak without shrinking. You walk without explanation. You are no longer a question. You are remembering. A living flame that did not burn you away, but burned you open. This is the quiet revolution. Not to save the world, but to no longer betray yourself. And now you do not seek the awakening. You are the awakening. If this message stirred something inside you, don't stop here. The next video will take you deeper into healing, growth, and self-discovery. It might just be the breakthrough your soul has been waiting for. Tap into it now. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and join a community committed to truth, transformation, and real inner change. You're not alone on this path. I'll meet you in the following video, where we continue becoming who we were always meant to be.